Hello, this is Chris Safarova, CEO of firmsconsulting.com and strategytraining.com. Welcome to another great session. We are here with Touraj, such a beautiful name. Touraj is a veteran Silicon Valley dealmaker. He has sat at almost every seat around the table in Silicon Valley since late 1990s. Imagine the level of experience. And has decades-long unique experience involving hundreds of M&A transactions, strategic partnerships, and venture capital investments totaling billions of dollars in aggregate value. He's currently the Chief Operating Officer at Serve Robotics, which he helped spin out of Uber. Such an amazing story. Looking forward to learn more about those adorable robots you have on sidewalks. And Touraj is also a graduate of the Yale Law School and Stanford University. Welcome, Touraj. It's so great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the kind introduction and for having me. Yes, looking forward to this conversation.
Touraj, to begin with, could you share with us your backstory?
Oh, absolutely. I won't go too far back, but maybe start at a place where I was introduced to this country. I'm a first generation immigrant. My family moved to Southern California after bouncing around the world in a few different countries in the late 80s. I went to high school in the US. And I sort of immediately realized, as someone who had very little money as a first-generation immigrant, that in order to get ahead here, I needed to have a pretty decent education. So I studied really hard and tried to get into the best colleges that I could get into. I applied to, I found one of these US News World Report rankings, and I kind of picked all the top on the list. Applied, and luckily I got accepted by Stanford. I think they saw something in me that resonated with who they were looking for, and I count my lucky stars for that opportunity. Loved Stanford University, so I spent 4 years there studying economics and philosophy. I wanted to balance the practical and the impractical. You choose which one is the more practical one. I would actually tell people that philosophy turned out to be the more practical one.
I say
that. And I followed that with law school. Again, as an immigrant, I kind of thought that this is a country based on laws. And so if I want to succeed here, I better know the laws. And I got to go to law school. Again, picked my US News World Report rankings, and Yale was on top of that. And I kind of went through the top 10 and applied to all of them. Luckily, again, I got accepted to my first choice and had a blast at Yale Law School. And I went to law school without a real appreciation of what the practice of law was like. I had an intellectual appreciation of what lawyers did and the legal system, and I just love the fact that this country is based on laws. It's so comforting coming from, for instance, Middle East, where things tend to be different. And I just didn't really know what the practice of law was like. I knew, based on my experience at Stanford, that I love Silicon Valley. I love being close to the energy, the innovation, all the things that were happening in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. So I had it in my mind that I wanted to come back to the Bay Area. So as soon as law school finished, I came and worked at a law firm, one of the prominent law firms here in the Valley called Wilson Sonsini, that represents startups from their formation through all the stages of their life cycle, including IPO and acquisitions. And I kind of immersed myself kind of in the deal making right off the bat. And it was late 90s, so there was a lot of activity. So fertile grounds for learning and also for burnout. So after 9 months, actually, I realized that this was not what I thought practicing law would be. And I wanted to be a little closer to the actual business of innovation. I have tremendous respect for lawyers and folks who do that. But I just didn't see a personality fit with me and where I wanted to be. So then I sort of applied to a bunch of different places. I'd seen that venture capitalists were doing really cool stuff. So I kind of networked my way to get a job at a venture capital firm. And again, through a whole bunch of serendipity and lucky coincidences through the Stanford alumni network, I got a job at a European venture capital firm that wanted to open an office here in the US in Palo Alto. And they were looking for someone kind of with my similar background. So that sort of became my first real introduction to business. I almost kind of think of it as getting an MBA, but I got paid for it. And you learn a lot as a venture capitalist. You analyze a number of business plans, and you talk to a lot of smart entrepreneurs, and you try to see, try to predict the future a little bit through the view of the entrepreneurs, of course. Learned a lot. Unfortunately, the early 2000s were not the most active times for venture capital in the US, at least not from a return on investment perspective. So the firm that I worked with decided to actually pull back from the US and redouble their investment efforts in Europe. After that, I had a bit of a crisis of confidence. I was worried that I may have made the wrong decision, throwing away all the legal education. And so I went back to law. So I went back and started practicing corporate law again, and spent 2 years this time instead of 9 months. And again, I realized, my heart and passion is really in entrepreneurship. And it wasn't which law firm I worked for, but it was the actual practice of law that didn't quite resonate with who I wanted to be. So this time I left law for good, and I started my own company. So that I got enough courage and support to bring this idea I had, which was, how do we bridge communications on the web with communications on the phones? And this was in the prehistoric, pre-iPhone era, where if you had to make a phone call, you could go broke, especially if it was long distance. Sending text messages actually cost per text message. But we realized that if you bring, and by we, I mean me and my technical co-founder, who was an expert in telecommunications, our thought was that if we transport those packets, the voice and text packets, over the internet, we could bypass all the toll charges, all the expensive gates that the phone companies were putting in front of you, because things can travel over the web pretty much for free. And that's what Skype did in those days on the desktop computers. So we had that idea. We were not the only one, apparently, who had that idea. Actually, 4 more startups formed in the same year, 2005, doing similar things as we did. But that startup's name was Jackster. It got traction rapidly. We got a lot of venture capital money. Top tier investors were so lucky to have them involved with us. Grew very fast and virally, because communications, if you have a communications tool, it's viral. Now, for those days, going from 0 to 10 million users in 1 year after launch was a massive accomplishment. And so we got a lot of awards. We're pretty excited and I would say arrogant based on our early successes. So we kind of put our heads down and focused on execution, and kind of ignored a little bit of the external realities and things that we'll probably come back to. But that came in 4 years to haunt us. So we hit the 2008-2009 downturn, the Great Recession, which is not unlike what we were going through today. The stock market crashed. Everybody, VCs weren't investing anymore, and we were faced with a situation where we had to quickly figure out what to do. And we were grow. That was our priority. And now make money had become the mantra of the day. And we hadn't been paying too much attention to that, to be honest. So it takes time to tweak your funnels and to iterate and to find out a way to profitably acquire customers and also convert free to paid customers, all that. And we just didn't have enough time for that. And meanwhile, we were like burning cash and didn't have many strategic options. We didn't have any real viable acquirers. So we had to do a fire sale in 2009. We basically sold the company for pennies on the dollar, if that. And so that was a very hard lesson learned. But then I kind of took those lessons and didn't repeat them in my next startups and had much better successes. And been both an entrepreneur as well as angel investor. Also through I mentor a number of entrepreneurs through an early stage fund that I've been involved with from the beginning called Pear VC. And also spent 7 years on the acquirer side at GoDaddy. So kind of I never had that experience from the big company side. So went through an IPO with GoDaddy, did a number of acquisitions, led basically strategy and partnerships for a number of our businesses at GoDaddy. And then you mentioned I'm the COO of Serve Robotics. This is my latest gig, actually, the one that I'm most excited about, which is an autonomous robotics company. And I've been there for the past 18 months since we spun out of Uber. And we can talk about that more detail, but I'll take a pause here.
Touraj, thank you for this amazing story. You have such a unique set of experiences, which makes your skill set much more powerful than what is average. And they are so diverse as well. If you look back at your time as a lawyer and as an entrepreneur, and then also as an investor, what do you feel are some of the key things that you apply to your day-to-day versus people who don't have this kind of experiences? Do you feel that you have certain insights and ways to look at the world that separates you because of your journey?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, one thing that when I reflect kind of like over the past 20 years, and I kind of see where I started from and what I know now, what would I have done differently kind of mindset. There's one thread that kind of goes through it all, which is the importance of relationships. It's something that as I grew more and more as an individual, as an entrepreneur, as a business person, I got to appreciate a lot more. It was definitely not at all emphasized in law school. Law school was a lot more about the importance of words rather than importance of relationships. But what I got to understand, and then when I was at the VC firm I mentioned, Early Bird, the first business experience I had in the beginning, I also was now from words, I went to numbers. I was so focused on numbers that I missed the real place where value is created. And that is actually the relationships, the human relationships. You know, at the end of the day, entities and companies don't do transactions. It's the people that do. And that was something that to me came with experience, and having also seen a lot of other people that are successful entrepreneurs or successful investors, and the kind of the common thread among them seems to be the fact that they are amazing relationship builders and networkers. So that was, you know, if you were to say what is that one lesson that you learned, that would be it.
So there are two types of people who have to repeat their mistake many times. I believe one of the driving reasons for that is because they focus on regretting and in some cases even blaming what went wrong and who was at fault, versus learning from it kind of and thinking, how is it happening for me? What can I learn from it, and how did it make me stronger and more equipped to be a better performer going forward? And so I know that when you had that fire sale of Jackstr, you then went into another startup, which is Webs, and you actually did things very differently there. And it's also connected to your recent book. So maybe let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I guess to make a mistake is human, but to repeat the same mistake is probably foolish. We're always going to make mistakes, right? So it's just a matter of is it going to be the same mistakes that you're going to make, or are you going to make new mistakes? And I feel like those entrepreneurs that succeed, they have a very experimental mindset about how they go about anything in their lives. And they see everything as an experiment. It's like, okay, well, that failed. That was an experiment that failed. Let's see what went wrong. And there are things that are within our control. There are things that are external to us. And so we have to kind of be accountable and hold ourselves accountable for what is within our control. So as you said, deflecting blame is definitely a surefire way to repeat the same mistake. And so, yeah, it's always a combination, right? Even with Jackstr, for instance, yes, we could blame it on the recession and the stock market and things that we had no way of controlling. So we could easily say, well, look, we were a victim to that. But then when you realistically look at it and look at like 3 other companies that started at the same time doing similar things, and they all had successful exits and acquisitions, then you're like saying, okay, well, you can't fully blame the external market either. There is something going on here, because why didn't the market apply to those guys and just us, right? And that's kind of it took me about 6 months to step back and lick my wounds and sort of regroup and realize, okay, what did we do wrong? And I think one pivotal decision at Jackstr that we made very early on was that we would not focus on any distribution partnerships. We would not focus on any potential acquisition or exits. We are going for an IPO. We have it figured out. We have viral growth. We have users. We have VCs chasing us. Why should we waste our time with anything else? So that was a key decision as a management team that we made. And I was a part of that, and I signed up for it. And that was a mistake, right? In hindsight, that was a mistake because that didn't account for things that are out of our control. And we didn't build in an insurance policy against those. So the next startup I went to, my first focus was, okay, let's not make the same mistake again. I actually gathered the leadership in an offsite. And I said, look, I know things are going great. Everybody's happy right now. But let's think about where we want to be when we grow up. What does success really look like for us? And let's define that for ourselves. And then knowing that, IPOs are very rare, and it's a lot more likely that startups go out of business, what are some potential strategic exit opportunities that we could have? Who would be on our wish list of potential acquirers? And why would they be on that wish list? Let's talk about that. How would we prioritize among them? So that kind of gets everyone kind of thinking about, okay, well, how do we really seriously think about a strategy of appealing to those acquirers, and how would they see us? And then once we had that framework and that rough plan in mind, then, we said, we don't have to sell today, tomorrow, next year even, but let's have this in the back of our minds and take steps to get to know these potential acquirers, build relationships with them. In case there is ever an opportunity, we have that option. Again, we never have to sell, but because we were cash flow break even, we were in that enviable position, right? As a startup, once you hit that point, it's an amazing relief because you're not in danger of immediately going out of business. But most missionary entrepreneurs, they care about the mission. They care about, seeing what they have built to grow as much as possible, to be in the hands of as many people as possible, to have the most impact that it can have. And a lot of times that is only possible with the resources of a bigger company. And that's where acquisitions make a lot of sense. So So we had that, we built those relationships, and lo and behold, 2 years later, we were in the lucky position that we're looking at either raising another round of financing to really grow, which would entail a lot of dilution and also even a longer horizon to liquidity for people who had joined early on. The company was at that point almost 10 years old, or pursue one of these strategic options. And so when one of the strategics made us an offer that we couldn't refuse, we agreed to tie the knot with them. And it was a great outcome for the founders, for employees, for investors. We had only raised around $10 million and we sold for over 100. So it was a great outcome for all involved. And I attribute a lot of that to that fateful strategy session that we had in an offsite, actually away from the company. We took a weekend trip, and I'm so glad we did it. At the time, it seemed like a luxury. It seemed like something we couldn't afford to do, but we did it anyway. And it paid back huge dividends. So I took those lessons, the juxtaposition, these radically different outcomes between Jackster and Webs, and then also a lot of other lessons from other entrepreneurs that I've been lucky enough to be a part of their journey as a mentor or as an investor, or even read about them or hear about them on podcasts like yours. And I've assembled those lessons into this book that you just mentioned. It's called Exit Path. And it took me 5 years to write it. And hopefully your listeners will find it useful, because it not only talks about what it takes to sell a company, to be on that exit path, but when should you start, which, spoiler alert, you should start it right away, no matter what, where you are in your life cycle of your startup. And also, it talks about how to build relationships, which is that core tenet of successful entrepreneurship, I believe. So how do you build those relationships? What are the steps you can take? And how does an introvert like me do it? Because, it's not easy. It doesn't come naturally. And I think there's a lot of introverts out there for whom relationship building and networking, maybe it's even something that is a taboo word. They don't want to approach it. And I used to have my own reservations about it. I felt networking was for opportunists, not for real entrepreneurs. But again, I've changed my mind, and hopefully my book will help a lot of other people change theirs too.
Touraj, many of my clients, they're in a position where they are quite successful in their careers. Large company, they're at relatively senior level, but they're starting to realize that they actually want to be an entrepreneur. And you actually made that transition. You worked for someone else, and then you went and became an entrepreneur. You went into it. It's not like you did something on the side for years and then...
I went all in, yes. I put all my eggs in one basket.
Exactly. So Touraj, what I wanted to ask you is, do you have advice for listeners and viewers who are currently listening to our conversation, and they're in a position where they thinking about starting their own business or starting a startup with a group of friends? What advice would you give them about that transition?
Yes. I have a few. I would start by saying that before you make the jump, so to speak, you sort of really step back and evaluate some of the mega trends, some of the opportunities, kind of pretend you are an investor and think about, okay, what are some of the big opportunities out there that I can uniquely contribute to, either because you have a passion about it, you don't have to have an expertise. I had no expertise about telecommunications until I did Jackster, but I learned a lot and learned fast. And I surrounded myself with people who did have that domain expertise and subject matter experience, right? So you kind of want to step back, think about, okay, what are some of the big opportunities out there that I can contribute towards, and that you feel passionate about. I know passion, perhaps maybe it's an overused word, but it is important. It is important for you to be missionary about what you are doing, because entrepreneurship is hard. And unless you're like seriously mission driven, you're not going to be able to stick through the ups and downs of it. It's just it's a roller coaster, and chances are your first startup is not going to make it. I mean, if you look at the statistics, most startups don't make it. And it's funny because you do have to have an optimism and conviction in your ability that you can do better than the statistics. But it is important also to keep the statistic in mind. So it's a delicate balance between the two, not to be delusional, but also not to be pessimistic, right? So there's just kind of be right there in the middle. So that is a mindset adjustment, right? So step back, see the bigger picture, have the right mindset, really meditate on what is appealing to you, to your heart, that you want to spend the next 5-10 years of your life on, and work really hard on. And then I would say this goes back to what I said earlier. Talk to as many people as you can, have a lot of coffee and lunch breaks and Zoom sessions, because every time you talk to someone, you'll come away more enriched and with a new perspective. And for instance, for Jackster, the first 6 months, we spend more time meeting and just discussing the idea with different people than we did actually coding or building anything, right? So it was a lot of just conversations and feedback. In fact, we drastically changed the idea from what we had started with to what we launched to the public. It was completely different based on all the feedback we gathered, just in casual conversations, or just having concepts that you can run by folks. So gather feedback. And then once you have enough data points and enough conviction that gives you a sense that there is something there, then yes, then quit your job and do it. But a lot of entrepreneurs do take time. It's not like they quit their job and then think about, okay, what am I going to work on next? And I want to be an entrepreneur. They actually lay the foundation and groundwork before they make that final jump. So I would say entrepreneurs tend to be actually very smart risk takers. They're not blind risk takers. And people confuse that sometimes. Just because you're taking risk doesn't mean you're going to succeed at it. But if you take smart risks, then your chances are much higher.
Touraj, and then a second question that clients often have, that they have to kind of decide, are they going with the route of starting something small and then starting to generate some revenue, some profits, and then use that to build the business and own 100% of it, and then pass it over to the children someday, maybe, or go another route and find investors and do it faster? And in your book, by the way, you mentioned that about 75% of businesses that raise $1 million actually never able to even return that amount back to investors. So what would be your advice on that decision?
Yes, so that is a really important decision. So, perhaps a term that sometimes you hear some investors use is like, are you a lifestyle business or are you a sort of a venture-backed business? And it's less about lifestyle as in like going by the beach and sipping margaritas, but more about, is this something that you want to have the ultimate control and ultimate ownership, and so that you can basically decide how fast you want to grow it and really have a different trajectory than, if you have investors, they're part owners and you have a board and they have a strong say in where you take the company, and you have an obligation to them to maximize the return on their investment. So it's no longer just about your passion and your mission, but also about financial returns for your investors and stakeholders. So, that is a very pivotal decision. I would say businesses that can be immediately cash flow positive and have income and sales and don't require a lot of investment in order to build a product or to build a user base. They tend to be much more in the lifestyle category. And then the ones that do need a huge upfront investment tend to be the ones that you need venture capital investors for, unless you're independently wealthy. But then even those who are independently wealthy, a lot of times they don't want to put all their money behind Elon Musk, except that he's a very unique individual. But most people prefer to have other investors involved. Now, you do get a lot of benefit actually from having investors. So my advice to a lot of entrepreneurs when they're thinking about this is that when you're getting an investor, don't just think about it in terms of money, think about it in terms of the relationship. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, I know, by the end of this podcast, but the investor actually is like a team member. They're going to bring in a lot of value, hopefully, beyond just their checkbook, which is what then would set you up for success. So picking investors, like picking the first founding team members, you have to be very judicious about who you bring on board. And sometimes maybe having the wrong investor is worse than not having an investor at all. So that's just a lot of general thoughts on your question.
Thank you, Touraj. And building on that, could you maybe share some of the key things to consider when selecting investors and when selecting co-founders? Yes.
So, I'll go back to perhaps the investors I selected for my first startup. It was trying to emulate and do for Skype, for mobile phones, what Skype did for computers. So basically bring that level of free communications to the mobile phone. So I actually went after Skype investors and said, hey, like, you guys succeeded with the desktop version. Do you want to do it on the mobile version? I could really use your expertise and lessons learned there. And luckily got one of them, one of the early Skype investors, to be an investor. And he was tremendously value add. Similarly, in other areas, perhaps one of the challenges that you feel as an entrepreneur is that your lack of operating experience. So you want to bring an investor that has the operating experience so you can learn from them. It could be domain expertise. It could be relationships that they have with an ecosystem where you would want to get closer to. Let's say, you need a lot of retail distributors to sell your product. Now, someone that sits on the boards of those as an investor would be phenomenal, right? So you want to think about what are the non-financial value adds that an investor brings, and what are some of the gaps that you have on the way to get to success, right? So start by having the end in mind and seeing what success looks like, and then work backwards and say, okay, what needs to go right in order for me to be successful, to achieve that destination, and who are the people I need to have with me on this journey so that I can be best positioned to achieve that goal. And some of those people would, of course, be full-time team members. Others would be investors, board members, advisors, perhaps other, professionals like lawyers and investment bankers, etc., that you hire along the way.
Touraj, and are there any red signs that you would recommend people to pay attention to when selecting co-founders and investors?
Yes, the red flags. As new entrepreneurs, you tend to disregard your own intuitions. Not that intuitions should always be the guide for everything, because they could be misinformed, but I would pay attention to intuitions, and especially when it comes to style, to culture fit. I think intuitions can be very powerful indicators, and that's an area I would kind of do a gut check. And make sure that if you're uneasy or something someone said didn't quite sit right, don't just shove it under the rug. Actually pay attention to that, poke on it, and follow up. Perhaps, you may wonder if someone has the right level of transparency or the right level of integrity that you're looking for in a co-founder and investor. Go deeper, have more meetings with them. And if you can, have reference checks. Talk to other people. For instance, for an investor, talk to other people they have invested in, both successful ones and actually perhaps even the investments that didn't go well, and understand how they behaved in those scenarios when they were on the board. One thing that happens, unfortunately, is that many investors tend to be cheerleaders when times are great and tend to be downers when times are tough, and come down hard and become really exacting when times are tough for an entrepreneur. I feel like that's the opposite of what would be a recipe for success. You want investors who are tough on you and kind of check your blind spots where times are great, but then give you the operating freedom and the breathing room to figure things out when you're under tremendous stress as an entrepreneur. So things like that, those dynamics, you really want to understand them before you either, accept their investment, put them on your board, or make them part of the team.
Thank you, Touraj. So let's say someone decides, they listen to our conversation, they like what you said, and they say, okay, I need investors. I want to have a huge impact. I don't have time for my grandchildren to have an impact with the business that I started on 100%. So they're looking for investors. They read your book. In the book, you say that you need to start thinking about exit from the beginning. But there is a signaling problem when it comes to investors. What do they do with this? What will be your advice?
Yes, yeah, a great question. And the signaling problem is as follows. A lot of investors are attracted to entrepreneurs who are mission-driven and who are brave and courageous, and they're willing to just fight the fight and are resilient, right? So those are the qualities that every investor is looking for. Now, if you talk to them about your exit strategy prematurely or without the right context, they may think that you're in it not for the mission, but you're in it to make a quick buck. So you're kind of building to flip or building to sell, which is not the right mindset for a successful scaled startup to have. So that is the signaling problem, right? Without setting the right conditions, you may come across as someone that you really aren't, but just because you're speaking like that person, the investors may interpret that you are. So to avoid that signaling problem, my advice is to, first of all, emphasize the mission, talk about the mission, make sure the investors are on board with the big picture strategy. Once that alignment is established, then talk about, okay, well, what are the risks in executing that strategy? What are the things that can help executing that strategy? And think about realistic scenarios. And once you get into that, then talk about, okay, well, sounds like, I need to also have a plan B exit strategy in case X, Y, and Z don't happen or go the way we want. In fact, if we have some organically grown relationships, like partnerships, etc., they can help accelerate the ultimate accomplishment of the mission. So, investors love entrepreneurs that are in love with their mission. So if you show that an exit strategy can be conducive to the achievement of the mission, the ultimate goal that you have, then you open up the space to have a dialogue around that. Otherwise, the investors will shut that down. It's like, why are you talking to me about your exit before we've even talked about what your long-term vision and mission is and what makes it possible? So that context setting is critical.
Touraj, and will your advice be, I guess it will be similar when it comes to communicating to your team?
In many ways, it is similar. And, to me, we're really talking about the leadership team, the folks that are going to be intimately involved in all the major decisions for a business. They need to understand that you, as the founder, as the entrepreneur, you are fully bought into your mission as well, and that you're committed to executing this mission. But above all, that you're committed to and open-minded to doing what is best for the company, for its employees, for its customers, for its investors. So it's a pretty big responsibility. And the more people appreciate the nuance of your position and the competing priorities that you have to kind of balance, the more empathy they would have for you and your decisions. You want to bring them along the journey. You don't want to like surprise people at any time, especially your leadership team. You want to bring them along on the journey that says, hey, look, we're building these relationships because perhaps 5 years down the road, we may be in a position that we want to sell, or they may be trying to get into this market. And if we don't have the relationship, they would basically pick another startup and become our competitors, and we would be kind of left in the dark. So you want to bring folks along why you are doing certain things, but I'll also make sure that they understand that you're not in it to sell immediately or kind of encourage that kind of mindset, because that can be very dangerous. Again, the thinking should be, what do we do to build a long-term sustainable business? And actually what you do in that, when you really think hard about that, is the same thing that you would do to build a business that's very attractive to potential strategic acquirers, because no acquirer wants to buy a failing business. They want to buy a business that has real structure and foundation, that they can pour fuel on the fire, but you need to get the fire going.
That is very true. So we spoke about starting from the beginning, focusing on exit strategy. Any specific steps you would recommend? I know that it is in depth covered in your book, but anything you would like to share here?
Yeah, I think, the very first step is to, of course, get this messaging, get an understanding of why an exit strategy is important, and having that kind of alignment among the leadership team, that cultivating the right mindset, I call it, is important in the beginning. The next step is then having that strategy offsite. And I have dedicated a part of the book to just how do you organize such a strategy offsite, from details such as where do you go, to what do you put on the agenda, what do you do in preparation up to it, how do you conduct certain brainstorming sessions that can tap into the power of divergent thinking and convergent thinking of your team. So divergent being their creativity, but then convergent being their analytic reasoning. So kind of bringing it all together. What are some of the topics that are ripe for discussion in those sessions? And then I also talk about how do you document this? Because if it's not written down, it doesn't exist, right? A lot of times meetings can be quite effective, but they're not productive because no one bothers to write down the conclusions of the meeting. So, and then when you capture those, what is the right framework? And I actually propose a simple template for what an exit strategy could look like. I call it the exit strategy canvas. It's got 9 building blocks. And so kind of, I become a little prescriptive here, but just as a way to have a default position for people to start from, but they don't have to exactly follow everything. It should be customized to the unique needs and industry and position of every startup. But at least I found that having a starting point is better than to come up with something from scratch.
Touraj, and what are your thoughts on how open-minded should entrepreneurs be on, as they're having this conversations about exit planning, how open-minded they should be to opportunities where acquirer becomes a partner, so potential partnership, or where acquirer becomes an investor?
Yes. I see all of those as great opportunities to build relationships, because ultimately an acquirer becomes interested in you because they believe in you, they trust you, they have confidence in you and your team and your product. So what better way to build that without having to rush it through a partnership or an investment relationship? Now you have to be careful about the terms of those partnerships and investment relationships so that you don't inadvertently prevent others from being interested in you because you got into this relationship. But savvy acquirers recognize that, and they don't want to tie you down to that extreme. So it's good to have legal counsel and other experienced entrepreneurs involved when you are in those conversations. Definitely something to encourage, I would say, to welcome. Don't be scared by it. Don't shut it down. Think about all the benefits that can come from it. And then structure those relationships in a way that you get the most out of it. If you make relationship building the priority, then a lot of these things become clearer. Now, some entrepreneurs worry that, well, if I reveal too much, then I may not be attractive anymore to this acquirer. Well, the truth is, sooner or later, they will find that out about you. You much rather want to know it now than, once there's a term sheet signed, everybody's excited, then they do diligence and they find out, this is not a company we want to acquire. That is terrible. So there's no hiding the ball. Truth will actually help you advance, and also what you want to find out is truth about them. Who is this acquirer? What are the things that are important to them? So that that gives you power, that gives you leverage, negotiation leverage, if and when the time comes for an acquisition. So you should see it as an entrepreneur, you should see this as a two-way street. It's not like the acquirer gets to invest in you and all they see is your under your hood, but you want it to be an opportunity for a healthy exchange of information and get to know each other better.
Touraj, and as you have observed many M&A transactions in your career, what surprised you? What did you not expect?
One thing I didn't expect, and I got to really appreciate that when I was on the acquirer seat at GoDaddy for 7 years, was how long it really takes for the courtship. And sometimes we even have one attempt at an acquisition. It doesn't happen for various reasons. It comes back in a year or two, and then it happens. So it actually, like I did a survey. It took more than a year on average for us from the first time we had met an entrepreneur to consummate an acquisition. And we did, over 20 acquisitions in my tenure there. So it does take a long time. And the sooner entrepreneurs get familiarized and build the relationships with their potential acquirers, the better their chances are of actually being there. The thing is that an acquisition happens when three things converge. One is there's a willing buyer, there's a willing seller, and there's a set of terms that the parties agree on. And for these three conditions to come together, it takes a lot of work. You may be a willing seller, but the acquirers may not be willing buyers. Or they may be willing buyers, but not at the terms that you would be willing to sell. So it takes a lot of cultivation and work to bring everyone and converge these things together. Those were some of the surprising things I found. I thought that if you put up a for sale sign on your startup, acquirers start coming and finding their way out of the woodworks. But lo and behold, they have their day jobs. The management team of an acquirer is doing their own thing. They're not going to change everything and prioritize your deal just because you're willing to sell. So you have to figure out how you're to time things, how to be on their roadmap, and how to make sure your willingness to sell and their desire to buy sort of converge. It's a lot of art rather than science.
Touraj, you mentioned the importance of building relationships many times throughout our conversation today.
Yes.
What advice would you give to people to become better at building lasting win-win relationships?
Yes, there's actually, I've dedicated a few chapters to this in the book as well, but I would say start small and do incremental improvements. Start small as just like in the coffee shop that you go in the morning or in the elevator. Just say hello. just get to know the people, the fellow human beings that you bump against during the day, and just sort of train yourself. Now, some people are natural extroverts, they're immediately great at this. But for the 90% rest of us, I would say become comfortable in approaching and talking to people and to getting to know personal details about them, revealing, being vulnerable about yourself, as small as getting to know someone's name, start there. That would be the starting point. Of course, to build strategic relationships, etc., it takes much longer. It takes repeated interactions. So with business partners, figure out a cadence of actually interacting with them. It's not just enough to send a LinkedIn note and say, hey, I found your interest. You have a very similar background to mine, and we have a lot of common connections. I thought we should connect. It's a great starting point, although I suggest better LinkedIn messages than that. But once you do get that connection, initial connection, it's a weak tie. How do you make that a stronger tie, right? And so that strength comes from repeated interactions, from the trust you build. And familiarity itself builds trust. So you want to have a regular cadence. Even if, again, you're not interested in doing a deal today or a acquisition or anything like that, just get to know the person, and one of the ways you can get to know them is by sharing information. Everyone wants to know information. So if you have insights that you can share and volunteer to them, I appreciate it. And that builds your profile as an entrepreneur. It adds something to that relationship. It is a starting point for a win-win. Now, you may not have an immediate return on what you're sharing, but over time, the return comes from the trust and the relationship that you're building. Also, it is important to know who to approach. Big companies have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees sometimes. So who is the right person to approach? So that takes some work, some research, understanding what is the org structure? What are the business units that tend to have the best fit with what you're doing? And then who are the leaders of those business units? Get to know them. A lot of people start with corp dev and biz dev people. I have been a corp dev and biz dev executive many years. I would say most of my life, perhaps, most of my career life. And I can tell you this, that is probably not the best starting point. It is a starting point, but I would say the decision makers are the operating executives, the people who are in charge of P&L, in charge of headcount, resources. The corp dev folks and the biz dev folks are in a way like cupids. They kind of have to set up the right setting, but the actual decision makers are elsewhere in the organization. So you don't want to just fall in love with Cupid. You want to also get to know the real intended.
Very true. Touraj, and in the beginning of our discussion, I think I mentioned that we will speak a little bit about your exciting work that you're doing now as Chief Operating Officer at Serve Robotics, and you have this sidewalk, tiny, adorable robots. I may have heard you mentioning that they're kind of a mix of a Minion and the Wally. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that, because I know it will be interesting to many of our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe I'll take a step back. The origin of Serve Robotics, it was actually a project that started within Postmates. A very good friend of mine, an amazing entrepreneur and technologist and visionary friend whom I have known for many years, and I convinced to move from Vancouver to Silicon Valley, was the head of this project. And the way he got to Postmates actually is a funny side detour, but perhaps interesting to your listeners. Him and I, when he was an EIR at Pear VC, the venture fund I'm affiliated with, him and I started on a project, kind of co-founded a startup that had to do with smart food selection, menu selection using AI. And we kind of went around and started gathering feedback. As I was mentioning, you have to kind of talk to a lot of potential partners and others. And one of the people we talked to was Postmates. And Postmates liked the idea and him, Ali Kashani, so much that they actually acquired that project, that startup. So that was the origin of him joining Postmates. And then he became the head of Postmates special projects, Postmates X. And since he had a background and PhD in robotics and LiDAR and AI, he immediately thought of whether robots could alleviate some of the pain points that Postmates had. Postmates is a food delivery company like DoorDash and Uber Eats. And so they started experimenting with robots. And it wasn't the cute robot you see today in the beginning. It was something hacked together like a science project. But then they iterated and they experimented. And within a couple of years, so the project started in 2017, 2019, they had this cute robot. So they went through a lot of iterations. And it's called Serve. So Serve Robot went on the streets of LA and started doing real deliveries from restaurants to on the sidewalk, from restaurants to customers. In fact, they did tens of thousands of deliveries. Postmates got acquired by Uber. And then during that transaction, actually prior to that transaction, the team wanted to spin out the robotics division to be an independent company because the opportunity that these robots were addressing was far bigger than actually any one company or even any one vertical could service. So because once you have these robots doing deliveries, they could deliver anything. It doesn't have to be just food. It could be grocery, it could be medicine, it could be other things, parcel, it could be anything that you can imagine. And then why just do it for one company? It could be, they could be doing it for everybody. So that was the logic for spinning it out. Postmates agreed to it, but Postmates got acquired by Uber. So that was put on hold for a little bit. Once that acquisition completed, Uber also agreed. So Serve came out and became an independent company in early 2021. So that's when I joined. So now I've been with Serve for a year and a half now. And I was always wanting to be with Ali and do something big together. And I'm just so grateful that this all came together.
It sounds very exciting. I'm looking forward to see one. I'm going to be watching out for them in LA.
Thank you. Yes, well, we are in the Hollywood and West Hollywood areas today, and we're expanding more and more. So we're not just going to be just in LA, but we're going to be in many other big cities. So watch out for us. Yes, and we are very much aligned with the small businesses and the cities because we bring down the cost of delivery by using this autonomous robotics technology. It's a lot safer than having cars do these deliveries, and it's greener, less congestion, less safety risks for the cities. So we're very excited.
Definitely. And Touraj, what is the vision for this adorable robot?
Yes. So I mentioned, our big mission is to be the future of sustainable technologies. We want to we are delivering a sustainable future. That's our mission. And it starts with food delivery, but we believe that this technology can be applied to many domains. So we are really introducing robots for the first time in mass scale, autonomous robots, to city environments, to environments where they are interacting with people in real time. Traditionally, AMRs, autonomous mobile robots, were limited to factory settings, so very constrained environments where people and real estate had to be configured to the robot. Now we are in a different domain. We're bringing these robots outdoor, and now the robots have to adapt to the external environment and the people, the dynamic interactions with people. We have even come across goats on the sidewalks of LA. So the outdoor environment is a pretty wild place, and these robots are figuring it out, how to navigate them safely and efficiently.
This sounds amazing. I'm looking forward to see where you guys going to take it.
Thank you.
We are close to wrapping up our wonderful conversation. The next question I want to ask you is one of my favorite questions. So you already shared kind of a little bit of an answer to this question when you mentioned that one of the things you learned was how important relationships are. But maybe you will have some other thoughts that you would like to share. So the question is, what are 2-3 aha moments, realizations you had in the last few years, or it can be decades, that were transformative for your career and life?
Oh, absolutely. So yes, relationships would definitely be on the top of that list. The other one is actually reflecting on the definition of success and really understanding what that means, not just for you, but for your startup, for any business, any association that you're with, really understanding what does success really mean for us. And almost I have this kind of framework where I say, okay, well, what do we have to believe to be true for success to come about, once we have defined it? And then what are the risks on our path to get there? And then across from those risks, what are the mitigating steps we can take to account for that? So I kind of almost in every project, every startup that I engage with, I have kind of start with that framework, and that's something that has evolved over the past 10 years as kind of one of my go-to things that I do. So start with success and end in mind, and then identify what has to go right, what are the risks, and what are the mitigants to go with it. And then the other one kind of is maybe a hack, a tip, life hack, what you call it, the importance of calendar. As I don't know, maybe as I'm growing older, what it is, but if it's not scheduled on my calendar, it doesn't exist. And our calendars truly reveal our priorities. So if you want to know what your priorities are, just reflect back on your calendar and see, okay, do I have the right priorities in my mind and what I'm actually doing or not? So don't ignore that little calendar there.
Thank you, Touraj. This is very helpful. And then another thing I want to ask you, and I often ask our guests, we often speak to our clients about what are you going to do on Monday morning at 8 a.m. differently based on what you just learned, let's say in a course. We always try to make it practical so people can actually get results from something they are learning. Based on our conversation, what would you like people to do differently tomorrow at 8 a.m.?
Oh, that's such a great question. I really encourage people to actually get out there and to experiment and see their ideas out there in action rather than overthinking things. Reality, as Peter Drucker said, never stands still too long. Things are dynamic, things are changing. And the more we just sit back and analyze, that gets more and more in the way of action. So the way, for instance, we did our robots, it's just put them out there, put them on the sidewalk. We have actually a company value. We call it find truth on the sidewalk, because truly the truth is out there, literally out there. And you have to go there and experiment. If you want to be in the business of innovation, experimentation is the path there. And there's no substitute for it. So figure out simple experiments, anything, no matter what you want to do, try to make it into a small experiment and run that experiment and see and learn from it and then iterate. So that would be, that's an advice I give myself, my kids, my teams all the time.
I love this. I often tell clients that life often feels like you're going up the dark stairs. You have a flashlight, and you only can see the first step, but you know what the step is. So just take it, and then you will see the next one. And we get so much more information once we start taking action. And then even if we took the wrong turn, at least we get a lot more information and we can make better decisions after that.
That's absolutely true. Yes, I agree.
Touraj, this is a great place to end this session. Before we do that, do you have anything else you would like to add or share?
No, I really actually enjoyed this conversation. Time flew. Thank you so much for the great questions. I hope your listeners also reach out to me if they have any feedback. I can be found on LinkedIn pretty easily. Or Twitter, as well as the website for my upcoming book, exitpath.net. To find out more about this, you can even go on Amazon and pre-order it, which I would very much appreciate.
Great. Thank you very much, Touraj. It was so amazing to have you with us today. It was such a pleasant, wonderful conversation, and you're such a great person. I could immediately see it before we even started recording. So such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. The feelings are certainly mutual, and I look forward to more interactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Touraj. So for everyone listening or watching, you can check out Touraj's book. It's called Exit Path, How to Win the Startup Endgame. And I will see you guys next time.